Building Characters Readers Can't Forget, Episode 16, Stitches and Story Studio Podcast. Okay, before we dive into today's episode, which is a good one and I'm really excited about it, I want to do a quick check-in on what's happening in the publishing world this week because there's a couple of things worth knowing. First, if you've been following along with the draft to digital story, just a reminder that May 14th is the date those new fees go into effect. If you haven't set up your D2D account yet and you've been thinking about it, now's the time. After the May 14th, new accounts will have a $20 activation fee. We talked about why that actually makes sense in a recent episode. But the short version is D2D is drawing a line against the AI content flood and a small financial barrier as part of how they're doing it. So if you're serious about publishing wide, get that account set up before the deadline. The other thing I want to flag is genuinely interesting. The Authors Guild has proposed that the publishing industry add AI consent clause to standard author contracts. This comes after reports that some publishers and publishing professionals have been using AI tools to evaluate and edit manuscript without the authors knowing. And the Guild is saying that it needs to be disclosed. Authors should have a say in whether AI is touching their work at any stage of the process. And that's true. I think it's important. I also think that this is a conversation that's just getting started, so we'll keep an eye on it as it develops. All right, that's the news. And actually, the news today is a perfect setup for what we're going to talk about in this episode, because the AI content flood, the thing that everyone's worried about, the antidote to that is not a better algorithm. It's a character readers can't stop thinking about. It's a person on the page who feels so real you half expect them to text you. And that's a human skill. And that's exactly what we're building today. So let's get into it. If you're here for the first time, I'm glad you found us. This podcast exists to help you write your first novel and understand the world you're publishing into. I'm Millie, and today we're talking about one of my favorite subjects, character development. Specifically, we're going to talk about building blocks of genuinely compelling characters, the patterns that are worth knowing about, so you can sidestep them early if needed, and how to build a character before you write a single chapter, so that when you sit down to write, you already know who you're following. This is foundational stuff, and it's the kind of thing that once it clicks, it completely changes the way you approach your story. But before we get too deep in it, let's talk about what we're reading this week. What have you been reading? I'm currently deep into The King's Deception by Steve Berry, and I'm having such a good time with it. And as you all know, I love Steve Berry. If you haven't read any of his work, he writes these incredibly propulsive historical thrillers centered around a former Justice Department operative named Cotton Malone. And every book takes you on a deep historical mystery that turns out to have some very real present-day stakes. In this one, we're in England, and there's this centuries-old secret involving the identity of Queen Elizabeth I that Cotton gets pulled into completely against his will, which is honestly kind of Cotton's whole thing. He's retired and trying not to get involved and is immediately involved. But what I love about Barry from the craft perspective is how he handles the pacing of the reveals. He layers historical research into the narrative in a way that never feels like it's a lecture or a history lesson. It always feels like a discovery. And his characters have this lived-in quality. Even in the middle of absolutely bonkers thriller plots, Cotton feels like a real person who just happens to keep ending up in these incredibly dangerous historical situations. So if you like historical fiction thrillers or just want to study how to keep the reader turning the page, pick up anything by Steve Berry. The King's Deception is where I'm at right now. And, of course, very happily hooked. All right, on to the main event. So, let me ask you something. Think about the last book you genuinely loved. Not just liked, but really loved. The one you recommend to everyone, the one you thought about after you finished reading it. I'd be willing to bet that what you're remembering right now isn't the plot. It's a character. It's the way someone talked or made a decision that surprised you and then felt completely inevitable in retrospect, or the moment they broke your heart just a little bit. Readers remember people, not so much the events, not even really the stories, but the people who made up that story. And yet, when most of us read our first novel, we instinctively focus on plot and on what happens, and we spend enormous amounts of time figuring out the sequence of events and much less time figuring out who actually is experiencing them. And that gap in the first draft is where things can go sideways if we're not careful. So here's the trap I see most often, and I call it the described not felt problem. It looks like this. Sarah was a fiercely independent woman who didn't trust easily. We've been told something about Sarah, but we haven't felt it. We don't know what it looks like when Sarah doesn't trust someone. Does she go quiet? Does she ask too many questions? Does she laugh at the wrong moment to deflect? The trait is on the page, but the person isn't. The fix is almost always this. Stop describing your character and start putting them in motion. The character is revealed through their behavior, not their biography. And what they do when things go wrong, and then what they do when they have a choice, and either option is going to cost them something, that's where the character lives. The other thing I want to name here is the difference between a character's trait and a character's behavior under pressure. And you can tell me your protagonist is brave, and that's a trait. But what does brave look like at 2 in the morning when you're terrified and nobody's watching? That's behavior under pressure. And that's the thing that makes a reader say, I know this person. There's a core truth I want you to take from this segment. Readers remember what a character wants and fears far more than they remember what the character looks like. Physical description is the last thing you need and often the first thing writers reach for. Then the internal landscape is a thing. What does your character desperately want? What are they most afraid of? The intersection of these two things is where your story lives. And let's take a pause for a moment on description of the character. To me, sometimes what kills me when they make a book into a movie is not so much the change in plot, because I understand the plot in its entirety would probably be a 4-hour movie, and you can't do that. So you've got to cut some things or move some things around to make it fit. But when I read a book, I always have this image of what a character looks like. And when they cast somebody who's completely different, let's say I'm thinking of someone tall and dark haired, and they cast somebody shorter and blonde, it ruins it for me. That's like not the person that lives in my head and not the person who, took me on some great adventure or some amazing romance. And then I just can't get behind it. So I always hesitate, especially if it's a book that I really loved, watching the movie, just because I'm so afraid of who they cast and how they look that it's just going to ruin the whole thing for me. Okay, so back to the core building blocks for your character. So this is some good stuff. So let's build something. Talking about the actual components that make up a character feel real or making a character feel real is because I think sometimes we talk about the character in very abstract ways. And what the writer really needs, and what I try to do, is really something concrete to work with. So it's want versus need. The first building block is the distinction between what your character wants and what the character needs. These are almost never the same thing, and the gap between them is an emotional core of your story. The want is the external, um, the goal, the thing your character is actively pursuing. It's what they could tell you if you ask them what they're after. The need is the internal and often unconscious. It's the deeper thing that they're missing. the wound that hasn't healed, the truth they haven't faced, the thing that they've learned uh, how to accept or let go before they could actually be okay. The most satisfying character arc has happened when pursuing the want force, the character um, then is forced to confront their need. They go after the thing that they think they want, and in the process, they often reckon with who they actually are. And that's the engine of every great novel you've ever read. Uh, and for some of us, probably this sounds very familiar because this happens a lot uh, in romance novels. It's very obvious in romance novels where you have a character who has had their heart broken too many times and they're no longer interested in seeking out love and romance. Inevitably, they find it reluctantly. And that's a perfect dynamic of what I'm referring to here. But it could happen in other cases. The Cotton Malone character, for example, he's retired. He doesn't want to be involved in all this, kind of international spy stuff or, working for the government and solving their problems. And of course, naturally, that's exactly what happens to him. Every time he turns around, there's another problem, or his old boss calls him up and needs help with something, and he gets pulled into something. So that's a great example of something that happens in every book. So the gap between who they think they are and who they actually are is what we're talking about here, and this is this one is so good, and it really separates flat characters and gets them into the three-dimensional role. And your character has, their self-image, the story that they tell about themselves, about who they are, but the reality is subtly or not so subtly telling a different story. And that's what you need to think about when you're writing them is like you're having the character explain themselves to another character, who they are, what they stand for. But then you write their actions to be something more, something deeper, and something they haven't realized about themselves. So maybe they think they're protecting people when they're actually controlling them, or maybe they think they're practical when they're actually afraid, and maybe they think they've healed from something, but they haven't. Uh, and again, the gap is where the drama lives and makes that intersection. And so that's where the reader's empathy also can come from because we've all been that person. We've all told ourselves a story that wasn't quite true. We recognize it on the page, even if we can't always name it in ourselves. So your backstory for your character really helps, it helps you develop this in the story. So if you kind of write out your backstory on your character sheet, before you get into the actual writing with the dialogue, it helps you form that dialogue. It helps you tell that story without just saying, you know, this person is this way because this happened to them. The end. You know, you can have maybe the person is sitting uh, having a beer with a friend, and the friend makes a joke about why don't you date more, or why don't you take that vacation you talked about, and the your character can then reveal something of themselves that maybe the friend didn't know through the dialogue, and that helps explain as a backstory a little bit. And saying, "Oh, no, because there was this time when XYZ happened, so therefore I'm not interested in doing that anymore," or something like that. So, um, again, just you want to have your backstory, and even if you write it out, it just kind of one dimensional, two dimensional in your character sheet. Just remember to translate that into something more three dimensional once you get into the story, and that's where the dialogue comes in to kind of help that, because then you're showing and not telling, or maybe there's an action scene where your character has to physically respond to something, and again, it's not dialogue, but it brings another dimension to that character. So what to put on the page. Here's something I want you to hear very clearly. You need to know your character's backstory, and we just talked about that. But it doesn't, it doesn't all need to come out um, on the page at one time. You don't want to info dump. Um, So it's really more of knowing the backstory without having to put all of it onto the page. It's kind of like an iceberg. Most of it lives below the surface, and it shapes everything about that you know about your character, how they move and they speak and they react. But the reader doesn't get to see that part. They're not seeing what's below the surface. Um, they can only feel its presence through the sense of the weight of it, and the more powerful your story and the way it's being told, through a line of dialogue, the physical habit, um, maybe a nervous tick that they don't even realize they have, a reaction that's slightly out of proportion to what just happened. And that's how you start revealing the backstory and how it lives on the page. It's not in paragraph after paragraph of explanation. This also is going to help shape your character's voice. Um, Voice is a thing that Cotton Malone has that makes me trust him as a narrator. His voice is the thing that makes you able to read 3 lines of dialogue and know exactly who's speaking without the dialogue tag. And that's, in my mind, very important skill to have because your brain kinda skips over those anyway, those he said, she said. It's a little bit different, in audio. It's a different skill in audio to be able to do that. You have to set it up a little bit differently, um, but get but focus on the book, on the written word first, and get that skill down. Uh, it's not just about the vocabulary, um, and the sentence length, even though those are important. It's fundamentally the worldview. What does your character notice, and what do they overlook? What's something they think is funny or not? And what are the things that they take seriously in the world and the other things that they may dismiss? So, the way the person sees the world is their voice, and it should be on every page. So, here's a little practical exercise to try. Take your character and put them in a scene that has nothing to do with your plot, like a low stakes moment, waiting in line, having a coffee with a friend, getting lost somewhere unfamiliar. No plot necessary, just them. What do you do? What do they notice? How do they treat the people around them? What's going on in their head? And if you don't know the answers, that's really valuable information. It means that you know what your character does in the service of the story, but you don't know yet who they are when the story isn't looking. So that's the person you're looking for, is that person or that character, and how they act when you're not looking, when nobody's paying attention to them. So let's talk a little bit about the patterns and the patterns that are worth knowing. Um, and I wish someone had really pointed this out to me early on, but patterns are really common when you're building out your craft, and they're completely fixable once you see them. So think about these as gifts from writers who went before you. The sooner you know them, the more intentional your writing gets. Um, so a character who exists only to serve the plot, this character shows up only when the story needs them. They don't have an interior life between their plot relevant appearances. They exist to deliver information or to be in danger or to provide comic relief. And they're not, when they're not doing those jobs, they pretty much don't exist. So the fix is to give every character a life outside of the plot. Even your minor characters have something they want, something they're worried about, someplace else they'd rather be. Even if none of that ever makes it onto the page, you knowing it makes them feel real when they do appear by the way that you write them. Uh, Another thing that um, I had to learn quickly is the likability trap. And this one is so common, and you'll understand it completely when I explain it. We want readers to like our protagonists, so we sand down all their edges. We make them kind and reasonable and generally pleasant to be around. And then we wonder, why they feel little and small and boring. Well, here's the thing, likability is not the goal, relatability is the goal, and none of us are perfect. Readers want to follow readers will follow, I'm sorry, a selfish character, an angry character, a morally complicated character, if they understand them, if they can feel the internal struggle or the logic of why the person is the way they are. Your protagonist does not need to be likable. They need to be human. And there's a difference. I mean, if we take a hard look at ourselves, probably not everyone we've ever met has liked us. And we're still okay. We survived that. They're okay without us in their lives. We're okay without them. Or maybe they're a work person and they're in our lives, whether they want them there or not. But it adds kind of on page a richness to the story. And this is kind of where the character, the character of your character, personality of your character comes out, because how do they react when they're confronted by a person they don't care for and doesn't care for them? And maybe that person isn't, a main character in your story, but your protagonist still has to deal with them. And so that adds a layer of complexity to your character. So every character in your book is the main character of their own life. They're just not the main character of your book. They may be supporting cast. They could be helpers. They could be obstacles, a love interest. But without their own sense of inner world, they feel like furniture, functional but easily forgettable. And while they don't have to have a huge presence in the story, if you're writing in a series, you don't want to make them so forgettable either, because maybe down the road, you want to take that small character and make their story bigger. Um, so in my Gates Point series, where I have a lot of intersecting characters, so the town is as much a character as all the individuals in it. And so in one book, the uh, owner of a business plays a part, a minor part. Maybe they sell a piece of property, or they somehow have a passing interaction with the main character of that story. But 3 books later, they become the main character of that story. And so there's a group of about 10 characters that I write about that they intersect with each other. New characters are introduced, other characters disappear forever, but some of them pop up every now and then in each other's stories, um, in different ways. Some in major ways, some in minor ways, some in passing, some are best friends. One book, um, Aaron and Penn are best friends. One book is about Aaron. One book is about Penn. But they still both show up in different levels in each other's books. And there's other friends in there as well. So uh, think of it in those terms if you intend to write a series, regardless of what genre it is. Those smaller characters need to be rich and have their own backstory, because you might want to pull from that later, and it's going to need to make sense with who they were in the book where you introduced them. Another part that I love is villains as obstacles and villains in the mirror. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because the most powerful antagonists in fiction aren't just obstacles to the protagonist's path, they're mirrors. They often reflect something back to the hero, some imperfection, their version of what the protagonist could become, or the person who made an opposite choice at a crucial moment, or someone who holds a dark truth and the protagonist isn't ready to face it, but that villain reminds them of that. Um, then the villain and the protagonist are in conversation thematically when their conflict is about something that is beyond just this person is in my way, but that's that's where the story really starts to feel the tension and really is turning into something. Um, I always think about Um, having I try to make sure all of my protagonists have at least one flaw of some kind that I can play upon, because if they're too perfect, I don't feel like they're believable. Even though readers are looking for escapism, um, they know the difference. I mean, our readers are smart, and some Prince Charming that's just absolutely perfect is gonna land flat. Um, he needs to struggle with something, or she needs to struggle with something. There has to be something, that makes them relatable to the reader. So I tried to find something that, um, you know, some not dark in that they're evil, but some dark, um, little nugget of information that is in opposition to what the character is normally portraying. And I make that a real effort to do that and find it, on the character sheet ever before I start writing the story. And people, writers write differently. Some people write are character driven, and some people are plot driven, and both are fine. Both are equally valuable. I am very much a character driven person and a dialogue person. And my I come up with the characters first and then the story. So I will come up with somebody in my head, and then I fit them on some kind of adventure, like, what would this person do? Like, I have the whole character and their backstory and everything, who they are, what kind of person they are, their favorite color, all that kinda stuff, and then I find a story to put them in. So sometimes I might have a character, and I might not even really have fully fleshed out what genre they fit into. Like, right now, I have had this character in the back of my mind for a while, um, that I can't quite figure out what to do with her yet, so she just kinda sits back there. Um, but I know her name is Six. She goes by Six, Six. Works well with, a science fiction, you know, genre. Somebody named Six could be, you know, I don't know, an android or, something. But it also could be, um, you know, a more sadder tale of maybe a foster child who just, was the sixth kid or something, and so that was their nickname, or came from a large family, and so that's their nickname. Um, this can be any number of things. So, um, she's sitting back there hanging out, um, trying to figure out where she goes, and I just haven't found the right home for her yet. But just that's just kinda how my brain works, and that all of my characters have kind of come to me that way. I've thought about and then thought about where would they live? Future, past, present, and what would they do? What would their life be like? What's their daily life? What are their hopes and dreams? And so if you're a character-driven person too, this will all make really, sense to you. I mean, it almost come naturally to you. If you're a plot-driven person, hopefully this will help you think about you've got your story and you've got your place. Now you need to populate it with your characters and your people. And so hopefully this will help you figure out how to do that and what kind of people and what kind of characters you want to live in this world that you have just built. So that kind of brings us back around almost full circle. So let's talk about actually building your characters before you start writing the manuscript. And I do that sort of intuitively. So when you sit down to write chapter one, you're not discovering who they are on the fly. Um, and this is where you want to use your character sheet to actually capture the personality of your characters and their backstory. Um, but I'm going to push back a little bit on the traditional sense of a character sheet because I think a lot of them ask us to fill out things that really don't help us all. I mean, it asks for favorite food, hair color, Myers Briggs type. These details feel productive, but they don't really tell you much about how the character is going to behave in a difficult scene. So it's okay to jot those things down, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time um, stressing over it. Uh, some of that can be kind of filled in later. So and it may even come to you later. Maybe the important thing is how they behave, and then you can kind of decide later, well, if a person's behaving this way, what would they look like to me? What would be my ideal for this kind of behavior? So that information that actually is going to help you is, what does this person want more than anything? And why do they think it's the one thing they want? And what do they actually need, even though they don't know they need it yet? And what are they afraid of? Not stuff like spiders, but like real fear, one that shapes their choices. And so, what do they believe about themselves that isn't quite true? Um, they believe they're past the heartbreak that they once felt and they're ready to move on, and maybe they're really not. And so they get cold feet. Um, was there a wound, a thing in their past that made them who they are today? And what would they never do? What would what would the it what would the make them what would make them do it anyway? I mean, like, they say they would never do a certain thing, and then suddenly a friend of theirs whose life hangs in the balance if they don't do the thing, you know. So what would that look like? So if you can answer uh, these questions, then you've got your character, and everything else is detail you can figure out as you go. Like I said, hair color, favorite food, favorite color, eye color, height, things like that. Um, the one question to answer, though, before chapter one is, if I had to distill all of this into a single question to answer before you write your first chapter, it would be this: what does this person stand to lose? Not just in the plot, but in themselves. If the story goes wrong, and if they don't get their way, or they don't get what they want, or if they get it and then it's not what they thought it was going to be, what's the cost? What could break? What's the emotional stake? And without that, the plot is just things happening. And once you know what your character stands to lose, you know what the story is going to really be about. And you know what you're building towards every time you sit down to write, because everything has got to feed into that thing. So we talked about story structure in a previous episode, but if you've listened to that one, and you'll hear these pieces connect, because the structure of your story really is just a container for the character's journey. And the two things are really inseparable. So I hope all of that really helped you kind of pull some things together as you think about your characters. And again, like I said, if you're a character first writer like myself, some of that may feel sort of intuitive to you, and hopefully that just kind of gives you permission to continue on with your intuitiveness of how to write your character. But if you're plot driven, hopefully this will help give you a little bit of framework of how to develop your characters more fully to live in this awesome world, in this awesome story that you have built, and make your characters deserving of being in your world. So before we go for this episode, before I close out, I want to share with you again, if I haven't already, um, Hostile Skies Anthology is on pre-order. It publishes on the 19th. Uh, 14 amazing stories and authors in there. So it's available on Amazon. So go check it out. And I would be genuinely thrilled if you grabbed a copy and gave a review. All of the authors we live for reviews. That's our currency. We love reviews. So if you could leave a review or a thumbs up or something, that would be so appreciative. And if you wanted to reach out and give feedback, that would also be amazing. Just directly, if you just wanted to give it a couple of stars or something, but you wanted to reach out via email to talk about it, that would be amazing as well. And the anthology itself, Hostile Skies, is exactly what it sounds like. It's a collection of science fiction stories set in environments where the sky itself is a threat. Space, alien atmosphere, worlds where flight means something completely different. It's kind of anthology where the story is its own universe, and the variety is the part that makes it so much fun. So my story in it is Whisper Protocol Surveyor, and it's about I don't want to give too much away, but it involves a surveyor on a world that isn't supposed to be inhabited, and there are signals that aren't supposed to exist that are very uncomfortable, and they're very uncomfortable. Question of what do you do when the thing finds you and starts changing your environment around you? So again, I don't want to share too much of that, but um, I'm really proud of the story, and I'm in wonderful company in this anthology. There's some amazing, amazing authors in there. William Allen Webb, J.R. Handley, to name a few. So the link to the pre-order will be in the show notes if you're a science fiction reader, or if you've been following along here and just curious about what my fiction actually looks like. This is a great place to start. So go grab it. I know you'll love it. Okay, so we started today talking about the AI content flood and what it means for authors trying to build something real in this very noisy landscape. And then we spent the whole episode talking about character development. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The thing that the AI generated fiction consistently gets wrong is the people. It can approximate a plot, it can hit story beats, and it can generate scenes, but it can't create characters who feel like a specific, irreplaceable human being. And that's because it requires the author to know what it feels like to want something and to be afraid of that same thing, and to have a wound and to build a wall around it and think that no one else around them can tell, uh, to make a wrong choice for entirely understandable reasons. And that knowledge is yours. And it's every experience you've ever had, every person you've loved and lost and misunderstood. The characters you build from those places are not replicable by an AI. They're yours. And here's your homework for today's episode. Pick your protagonist, and if you haven't started yet, the character you drawn most to writing, and answer this one question. What do they stand to lose? Not just in the plot, but in themselves. Write it down. Even if it's just a sentence or two, that sentence is going to be the seed for everything. So I hope you enjoyed today's show, and please feel free to reach out at Millie, Milly, at stitchesandstories.com. You can support me and the podcast through Melissa L. Story at Substack, or Melissa L. Story at buymeacupofcoffee.com. And as a reminder, Melissa is spelled Milissa. Initial L, Story. And I will have links to all of these things in the show notes and some resources for building characters, some books that might be helpful, articles. And I'll see you next week.